Are you ready to do this?
Let's do it.
Okay. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Kari Gleiser. Kari, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right. So Kari is a clinical psychologist in Hanover, New Hampshire, specializing in the treatment of complex trauma and dissociative disorders. She's a senior faculty member at the AEDP Institute, that stands for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy, and co-director of the Center for Integrative Health. Keri has developed a relational model that incorporates AEDP into work with dissociative disorders and dissociative parts of the self called Intra-relational AEDP. And as well, you are an ultra runner. How cool is that? Well, let's forget everything else. How long have you been doing that?
I've been doing that for about 6 years.
Wow. Wow. All right. We'll get into that.
Wonderful.
First off, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from now.
So I'm calling from Hanover, New Hampshire, which is a little college town nestled in the mountains, with lots of great trails, lots of great rivers, beautiful outdoors. I wouldn't call them untouched swaths of wilderness, but you can definitely get out on some trails and not see another human being for long periods of time. So that feels pretty wild to me.
Cool.
And the question of where I'm from, I never really know how to answer that because I grew up kind of all up and down the East Coast and ultimately landed in New Jersey, but that never felt like home to me. So I kind of end up feeling like I'm a citizen of the world.
Cool. You know, I was in Hanover, New Hampshire. I did a wilderness first aid course there. There's I think there's a school there that's really.
Is it affiliated with Green Woodlands?
I don't know if
that's
it's
a beautiful expanse of running trails and cross-country ski trails.
But it was a pretty crazy place. It was in the winter too, so it was cool. Anyway,
even more challenging. We can do it here.
Yeah. So let's start out here. How did you get into this field and this specialization?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. So I was actually a Dartmouth student. So I've been here for like forever. Dartmouth is the college in Hanover. But I was originally a creative writing major specializing in poetry. And in my senior year, I took a class called Trauma and Prose Fiction in the Comp Lit department. And it was an amazing class. And we read trauma narratives and we read Judy Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. We read a whole bunch of clinical trauma texts, and I was completely hooked. You know, I think I come from a family where there's a lot of intergenerational transmission of trauma that has never been healed. And so I think it also resonated for me on that level. And I was like, this is my calling.
What resonated with you specifically about that?
That's a good question. I think it was something about pulling from being in intense conversation with myself and my many selves as a poet. You know, I was along this trajectory where I really thought I was going to be a writer and write poetry. And that is a series of intense conversations and worlds and dimensions inside the self. And ultimately, I think that would have driven me a little crazy. I mean, I have a tendency to kind of dive deep into things, and I think I would have dove too deep into myself and not landed in a good place. So it was kind of a new pathway where I got to get out of myself, but still engage in intense dialogue, intense relationship. And, you know, it took me a few more years when I was in a PhD program at BU to encounter Diana Fosha and AEDP. And then that was my landing place. I felt like, okay, this is my clinical home. This is what I feel like I'm meant to do on this earth. It's what I want to help other people move into these realms of intense interconnection with emotion and with other, and, you know, just following the glimmers of resiliency and following the glimmers of true self. And
I love that.
So a lot lit up.
So you're at Dartmouth, you get into this course. How did things unfold such that you're like, okay, I want to switch paths here?
Yeah, I ended up going to Rome, Italy, actually, because that's my other kind of one of my other selves is just a world wanderer. I love to travel and I love to wander and explore. So the year after college found me in Rome, Italy on a Rotary Fellowship. And I studied psychology there. And I just it was a wild leap, right? It was kind of a blind leap of faith, like close your eyes, jump out over the abyss and hope you land on the other side in clinical psychology. Because I had only taken Psych 101 as a Dartmouth student. I had not taken any core psychology classes. I hadn't done core GREs. And I was like, this is where I have to go. And I'm just going to make a blind leap of faith. And so I studied, I put that in quotation marks, studied psychology in Rome at La Sapienza and applied for grad schools. And luckily BU was in this kind of transitional phase where they admitted alternative students. And I guess something in my application appealed to them because they let me in. I'm eternally grateful for that. So I kind of went from no psych classes to being a doctoral student in clinical psychology.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get there, Diana
Mhm.
Fosha, AEDP.
I saw her present and was just like this. I should mention, I also had an amazing advisor, Fran Grossman, who was doing work on trauma and resiliency. And I was her grad student. And she immediately brought me into a world of qualitative research on trauma and abuse survivors and what kind of are the particular ingredients that promote and foster resiliency. So
What specifically was it about Diana Fosha's presentation that lured you in?
so she showed this amazing piece of work. Well, I should say she and we in AEDP teach by using videotapes of actual clinical sessions. So you really get in the experience immediately. And there was something about her courage and her bravery and her intensity to go in there. And she did a murderous rage portrayal with this woman who lived in a Hasidic Jewish community and just went for it with this woman and showed it in this conference. And I was like, that is so brave and that is so intense. And it was this wave of rage and then relief and then connection and gratitude and the intimacy of the encounter and just everything about that appealed to me. And I thought, this is using emotion to heal.
So it was
And
between her and the client?
yes, between her and the client.
Wow.
And so AEDP is this model. It's an emotional processing model, but it's also an attachment model. And we help clients move through waves of healing adaptive affect. Of course, we help them regulate the non-adaptive affects and emotions that are not going to healing places like aloneness and despair and hopelessness. But part of the science of AEDP is kind of identifying this emotional map of which are the emotional experiences that are going to kind of crest in a full wave and come out the other side and leave the person transformed. And by person, I mean often patient and therapist alike, right? Because you both are deep in this experiential wave. And, Diana, through studying the phenomenology of what happens when you just stay with experience. So AEDP is not a narrative-based therapy. You're not staying with people's stories. In fact, from the very first session early on, we say to people, we want to get beneath the story as soon as possible because stories are often scripted, they're often stagnant, they're often old, they're often outdated, they're often toxic. And we want to get to felt experience. We want to get to felt emotional experience, felt somatic experience. We want to make the relational experience in the therapeutic dyad as awake and alive as possible and use it. So we ask really bold relational questions like, what is it like when you hear me say that? Or what is it like when you look up in my eyes? And we're not fishing for compliments here. We're really kind of extracting a relational experience that's happening in the moment and opening it up and creating new relational experiences.
Wow, I love
Yeah.
that. When you talked about your experience with writing, I wrote fiction for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and I moved from that into, I had a particular experience that kind of jettisoned me into wanting to help people who've been traumatized. So,
Mm-hmm.
but that there is for me, the correlation was, and this kind of gets to what you're talking about right now, is I was writing a lot about what I actually needed to do and to get
Yes.
into and to experience. So this kind of in the moment, right now, experiential aspect is really intriguing to me, and I think it's so crucial.
Mhm.
Um, what about that attracted you or inspired you and continues to do so?
I think there's something so pure and so raw about experience. And when you look at an infant, they don't have filters, they don't have schemas, they don't have categories. Their mind is so kind of fresh and also so sensitive to the experiences around them and how things are getting formed and formulated. And I think as we get older, we start to rely on these schemas, and if you have a trauma history or an attachment trauma history, those experiences, traumatic experiences and traumatic emotions get scripted into your schemas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they can almost become um, filters and ways of separating from experience. And so when we help in experiential therapy, especially in AEDP, when we help people peel back those layers, I mean, we recognize them and oftentimes we name them, but then we say, let's not go with those.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if we can create something different here where emotion is not overwhelming, where you're not all alone with it, where you have a felt sense. Because I think a lot of what we try to procure in AEDP is actively an ingredient in a lot of other therapies, right? Support, comfort, accompaniment, recognition, care, even love. But what we do different in AEDP is we name it explicitly and we work with it experientially. So we
Mm.
use that as yet another doorway into experience,
Wow.
right?
When you're working with someone, and it's hard to generalize, I know, but with individuals who've experienced trauma, let's say interpersonal trauma,
Mhm.
where the willingness to maybe go in beneath a story that maybe they've used as protection, right?
Yes.
How do you develop that, through the relationship? How do you work?
A great question. So, first of all, I will very tenderly and lovingly recognize that that protection was life saving, and that it's not that I'm devaluing the protection or devalidating the protection at all. But what I want to do, and I tell people this very explicitly and transparently, and kind of the more severe the trauma history, the more I work to be transparent because, I
Mm.
don't want there to be mystery or, secrecy or, I don't want it to seem magical, right? I want it to be all laid out there. I might say to someone, the reason you needed that protection is because you were all alone with this, right? You were all alone when it happened. You've been carrying it all alone. You've been experiencing it all alone. Maybe you've talked about it before, but the raw, unmetabolized experience inside of you is something that stays tucked very far away, maybe even from yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so our job is to create enough safety that you get to use all of your capacities and all of my capacities together, right?
Mm.
So that we can create enough safety that we can go under those protections, under those stories. We can get close to those emotional experiences that have been dissociated, that have been locked away, right? And we can help them move through. We can help them process and move through.
You talked about naming the moments and what's going on, and that too, right? I mean, that a lot, that's intense, and I think that can be intense.
Very intense.
um One of the other things here that I think has to be mentioned, I want to mention, is this takes a lot from the therapist. I think it takes a lot of
Absolutely.
openness, and what you mentioned, what I think Diana Foch's, like, courage
Mhm.
to do that, to get there, to be able to do that requires, I think, a certain authenticity.
Mhm.
What was that journey for you? Or maybe because you were a writer, you were just like ready to do that.
I was ready. I was ready and I was ripe. And something so deeply resonated about this stance that I think really embodies an open heartedness, and it embodies a kind of boldness and not just a willingness to be authentic, but like a hunger to be authentic.
Mm-hmm.
and to spark that in somebody else. In AEDP, we talk about using ourselves as a true other to kind of evoke somebody's true self. Because we in AEDP, and I personally deeply believe that when somebody comes into my office, they have everything they need to heal nestled inside them. They may have just buried it, covered it up. It may be obscured. It may be layered. It may be papered over, but it is in there, right? That there is a true, unbroken, whole, luminous self in there, just awaiting the right conditions to be released. So I see my job as using all my skills and all my open-heartedness and everything that I can model and embody to help somebody have the bravery, hand in hand with me, to dive in there and go after that true self. And I should say, I'm emphasizing all the kind of bold, intense, emotional aspects of this, but we also take very seriously this notion of dyadic regulation, right? We don't want people to be overwhelmed, and we moment to moment track very carefully when people are getting close to the edge of their window of tolerance. And so if somebody is getting really emotional, I'm tracking with them with all of my observational abilities, and collaboratively with them. Is this too much? Is this still within what you can bear? You tell me if it gets unbearable, because I don't want it to be unbearable. We're watching to make sure people don't tip over into flashback or panic or overwhelmed, that they're not dissociating. And if they do, we switch gears, and we go to regulation. We use the relationship not only to build bravery, but also to ground and regulate, similar to what parents do in an attachment relationship. Dyadic regulation is a very crucial part of good parenting, and it's a very crucial part of good therapizing.
Yeah, let me just kind of reintroduce you here. I'm speaking with Dr. Kari Gleiser, senior faculty at AEDP. And I know a lot of people are listening to this and going, oh my God, I got to study this. Seriously.
A lot of people get lit up by this, and they feel people describe when they feel a calling to AEDP, they describe it as a feeling of coming home.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. So what do you specifically do? Do you guys offer courses or online trainings?
Yeah,
what?
Absolutely. People that are feeling that little spark right now can go to the AEDP Institute, just www.aedpinstitute. I think it's org. I always get it confused if it's .org or .com. At some point we had both, and I can't remember which one, but you'll see it.
It's .org, aedp.org.
Okay.
Yep.
And we have all our courses. The introductory course is called the Immersion course, and it's a 5-day course, usually taught by Diana herself. So you get kind of direct access to the inspiring founder of the Institute. I think some of the courses are starting to be taught by other of our faculty who are, equally gifted and lit up by this work. So.
Okay. And I'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. A couple things. So I had mentioned that you were an ultra runner.
Yes.
And I want to talk about that. But before I do, I want to ask you about kind of an early clinical error.
Sure.
Your one clinical error when you were just starting out?
I think there's probably a few more than one, but there's definitely one that stands out more poignantly, let's say. And I think as an intro to this, I want to just say a little bit about this intra-relational model that I developed actually with another AEDP faculty member, Jerry Lamagna. We were both studying trauma and dissociation, and particularly ego state therapy, Watkins and Watkins. And we just started to realize that all of AEDP's attachment and emotional interventions, all those explicit experiential interventions that we do between therapist and client, could also be done between client and their dissociated parts.
Oh, wow.
And between therapist and the client's dissociated parts. And I know that's kind of controversial, actually, in the dissociation world. A lot of dissociation experts and therapists say, don't get too close to the dissociated parts. Stay with the adult client, the resource client, the host, and to use the old, NPD language, and have them talk to the parts. You really always want to go through them. But in intrarelational, we kind of tip that a little bit on its head, and we say, each of these three kind of avenues are different attachment relationships, right? So I can have a attachment relationship. Let's pretend for a moment that you're my patient with Guy, my adult patient. And I can also I do have, whether I like it or not, whether I acknowledge it or not, I have a relationship with all of your dissociated parts, right? So little boy parts, critical parts, all those parts are in you. And so they're in the therapy room. And if I say, nope, I'm not gonna work with them because that's gonna endanger, you to be too dependent on me, or it's gonna weaken you somehow, then essentially I'm saying, nope, I'm giving those parts the hand. I will only talk to you and go through you to get to those parts. And in interrelational, we say, okay, there are risks. I'm not saying there are not risks, especially for certain, patients who really are looking for rescue or they feel like the strength is in the therapist, not in themselves, right? That there are real risks. So you have to do it mindfully and intentionally and carefully. But in interrelational theory and interventions, we say you kind of got to do it. You gotta have secure attachment with your patient, with your patient's parts, and build secure attachment inside between the patient and their parts. You can't neglect anyone. I'm kind of making a triangle with my hands because we draw that in interrelational theory and interventions. Like there's an upside down triangle with a point pointing downward, and the therapist is at the point, right? And at one corner is the patient, and at one corner is a dissociated part. And I've written about this as prisms, right? Because there are many parts of the patient and many parts of the therapist all in relationship, but we need to simplify it, right? To just be able to imagine it. And each of the sides of the triangle represents a relational field and an attachment relationship. So I have an attachment relationship with my patient and with their dissociated part, and they have an attachment relationship with that dissociated part. And so we craft in interrelational AEDP, we craft experiential attachment interventions on all three of those sides of the triangle, amongst all three of those dyads. And sometimes we skip around a little. So here's a good example. The other day I was having a session with a patient, and then I'm going to get to my mistake because this was all entry kind of lead up to that. I was having a session with a woman that I have treated for quite a long time in therapy. She has a dissociative disorder, not full-blown DID, but pretty far along the DDNOS spectrum. And we were working with this teenage part of her that had been raped multiple times. And she was talking about how alone she was all through adolescence. And I was trying to get her to make contact with that part. Can you feel that part? What does she need from you? What would you like to say to her? And nothing was really working. I couldn't really quite get that pathway going there, right? And she mentioned she has a little boy. She mentioned something about, on a side story, about how she soothes and regulates her son by going forehead to forehead with him. They just go forehead to forehead. And I said to her, what if you were to take that beautiful connecting gesture and go forehead to forehead with this teenage you, right? She burst into tears, right? And she did it and she felt it, right? So that's that top of the triangle. She made deep contact with that dissociated part of herself. And she's crying so hard that she's getting a little bit dysregulated. And so I said to her, can you look up at me and can we go forehead to forehead? And she, another wave of just dissolving right into like, oh my God, this is what that part needed. And this is what I need, right? And in some cases, if she hadn't been able to go forehead to forehead with that part of her, I might have suggested, would it be okay for me to do that? So I'm not afraid to get in there with the parts when somebody has already shown that they're not capable of doing it yet themselves. And that yet is really important, right? Because we're modeling through the work. We're modeling capacity, we're modeling regulation, we're modeling emotional processing. And when you can do it in a kind of balanced way, I talk about equilibrium on each side of the triangle. You
Mm-hmm.
have to do it mindfully, intentionally, and with equilibrium in mind, because I think my personal theory is that a lot of reenactments and a lot of kind of therapist dead or therapeutic dyad kind of dead ends or impasses come from an imbalance in this triangle. We put too much, we're demanding too much of that relationship between patient and dissociated part, or we're doing too much with the dissociated part, or we're not doing enough with the dissociated part, right? That there's some weakness in that triangle. And just to switch metaphors, like if you had a 3-pronged stool and one of those legs was weak, the stool would topple, right? So I think the triangle can topple if there isn't equilibrium when you're doing that kind of work.
Wow.
So that in a nutshell is kind of interrelational.
Well, I'm going
Here.
to have you back to talk about that
Okay, sounds
exclusively.
good.
I mean, that's amazing and really exciting work. Um, so let's share with us kind of the opposite end of that continuum in a sense.
Yes, the mistake.
The mistake or error.
Yes. So this was pretty early on in my career, before I had kind of really conceptualized this interrelational work and triangle as a balance and an equilibrium. And one thing I always say in training is, when you're working with dissociative disorders, you have to sometimes see what is unseen, and you have to see the invisible. You have to hear what's not being said. You have to like see beyond what's in the room. And this clinical, I would even call it a clinical, not just a mistake, but really a clinical failure, was stemmed from my not seeing beyond what was going on in the room. So I was working with this young male college student who presented as super avoidantly attached, no friends, no relationships. And I worked hard to earn his trust. I worked hard to build a relationship and, ultimately broke through. But what I didn't realize and what I didn't really attend to was on the other side of that avoidance, there was so much dependency longing and even so much rage, right? There were parts of him that held real rage about the dependency needs. And so as we're building this, what I thought was heading towards secure attachment, there were all these unseen parts just waiting in the wings. And as soon as we had a rupture, a therapeutic rupture, which is part and parcel of trauma work, it's part and parcel of any therapy work, and it's so important to acknowledge and repair and work to repair to completion. It just seemed to give free rein to his rage parts, not to work toward repair, but just to show up session after session with an agenda to show me what a terrible person I was, that I had participated in this rupture with him. I mean, and it really got to the point where I felt like there's no therapy happening here. He's just showing up and being, and I can tolerate rage toward me if it moves through, if it's part of a therapeutic process. But this seemed so rigid and kind of crystallized, and it wasn't moving. And so eventually I just had to say, this isn't therapy, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for me, and we have to terminate. And so we did. And, it still pains me to think of it. And I think it was in part, me not seeing what was behind, the visible, right? It was not seeing.
How does one do that? I mean, I can imagine that being very challenging for a new therapist, and even for an experienced therapist. But I would imagine that a more experienced therapist is more seasoned, has a lot more experiences, can see
Right.
what's not in the room.
Right. Or sense it. I mean, I think sometimes we sense it in our
Right.
bodies. Sometimes we can just wonder about it. I wonder if there are other parts of you as we're getting closer that have other feelings about it, about our relationship. I think, now I know better that, there are always two poles of disorganized attachment, right? And somebody can look like they are avoidantly attached, but really they can be kind of disorganized and have these preoccupied parts, as kind of the other end of the spectrum, just waiting to kind of kick in with all of the dependency longings, all of the whatever's in there, anxiety about it or rage about it or fears about it. And it's really important to notice, like, I'm doing this with my hands because, like, that's
Mm-hmm.
disorganized attachment, right? Come here and let me push you away. And if you
Mm-hmm.
just listen to one of those hands, you're going to get in trouble. And I think I got in trouble.
Mm,
And, it still pains me because I wish I could go back and do it different. And
right.
I still wish this young man well, wherever he's in the world.
Well, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. Look, so we're winding down here.
Okay.
There's Keri. I've got to have you back
Okay, I'd
soon
love to
because
come back.
I really want to get into that model that you created, and I do want to talk about. You had mentioned your relationship with ultra running and so forth, but let's kind of wind down here. And if you could share a go-to book recommendation, whether it's trauma related or not, or
Sure.
AEDP related.
Can I throw out a couple?
Of course.
So I have to suggest the AEDP 2.0 book, which is coming out this spring. It's called Undoing Aloneness and the Transformation of Suffering into Flourishing. And it's an APA book. So it's put out by the APA Press. And I think it's coming out in April sometime. And I have a chapter in it. That's not why I'm recommending
Oh,
it.
nice.
Actually, it's the relational prisms one. So it talks about interrelational. But the reason I'm recommending it is because many faculty have contributed to it. And it's AEDP is a model that, due to Diana Fosha's generosity, she's really allowed a co-created model to kind of evolve and move. And, faculty don't just teach her model, we
Mm-hmm.
contribute to it. And she's always
Mm.
encouraged that. And so AEDP 2.0, that's kind of the title. And then the colon is, and then the undoing aloneness part. And the 2.0 is like the next evolution, right? It's what AEDP has become. So it's a deep dive into all the wonders and and details of AEDP. The other one that I would recommend that I read last year and just loved, and I should probably do a little trigger warning on this one because it does have pretty explicit descriptions of trauma in it for people who are really sensitive to that, is Educated by Tara Westover.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's I think the best autobiography of trauma that I've read.
Wow.
She just gets into the nuances of what it's like to live with fear, with resiliency, with escape. I mean, she's such a good writer.
Mm.
And I just was on the edge of my seat reading that. I usually don't read trauma autobiographies or, trauma kind of fiction anymore because I get so much of that during the day that I just want to kind of escape into other stuff. But I couldn't resist, and I'm really glad I didn't. And then the
Awesome.
last thing, because I was a poet and am in some ways still a poet and love poetry and actually talk about experiential experiences. Whenever I read poetry, I cry. So it just immediately, even if it's not a sad poem, it goes immediately to my limbic system and unlocks emotion, and I get moved. And so I'm rereading Walt Whitman's Song of Myself right now. And I would love to recommend that people take a look at that. I mean, any poet that can write, I contain multitudes, is like, right, it's ready for hearts and dissociation and mysticism. He's like an amazing mystic. So I think, it's a beautiful poem for experiential work.
3 books. Awesome. The AEDP 2.0. Is that out yet, or is that coming out, forthcoming?
You can pre-order it on Amazon.
Okay. And Educated by Tara Westover and Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. We'll have those linked up. Wow. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
And so fun.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you back, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.